It's one of the oldest lures there is, also one of the simplest, and still one of the most popular. We're going to talk about the perennial favorite, the spoon, for multi-species angling on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey there, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 stores, or 140 plus stores, I should say, nationwide. Been a partner of ours since day one, so going on 20 years with Sportsman's Warehouse, and I hope you'll show them some love if you like our content. Also, the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado, also been with us since early days of the career, and love those guys as well. So check out Peterson Toyota if you're in northern Colorado. They all love to fish. A bunch of those dudes have boats. Good group of guys there selling Toyotas, and of course my Tundras have all come from there. Guys, it's what are we, August 2nd or 3rd, something like that, and I apologize if I sound a little discombobulated this morning, more than normal even. We are currently facing down a big old wildfire here at my house in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm about maybe 3 miles as the crow flies from a 10,000 acre wildfire that there's all sorts of aircraft and a few hundred people fighting. We've got everything from DC-10s and Super Scoopers to Chinooks and Firehawk helicopters flying around here. So if I sound distracted, that's because I'm on a pre-evacuation order, but hey, the show must go on. And if it gets closer, I'll worry about it then. But right this minute, don't get to fish. The lake's closed to boats, and I'm just putting out hot spots as they show up. So anybody in the West is probably dealing or could be dealing with something similar. And so my thoughts go out to all those guys as well. So lake's closed to boating, and that's got me in the shop a bunch and working in the shop. And one of the boxes I just went through is the inspiration for this podcast, and that is my spoon box. And I'm going to start off by saying a spoon is not sexy, a spoon is not complicated, they're not real popular in terms of selling them. Manufacturers don't all brag on their new spoons. They don't make a big splash at ICAST where I just was. But at the end of the day, I worked for 5 years at Sportsman's Warehouse, and I worked in the fishing department. And what I can tell you is anglers love spoons. We used to sell a ton of spoons, all kinds of spoons for all kinds of fish. And in my personal angling, I use them in the right scenarios. They're the right bait. And that can be said for almost any bait, but spoons particularly, when it's the right idea, it is the right idea more than anything else. And I don't know if that makes any sense the way I just put that, but the thing about a spoon is it has a certain built-in erraticness that really no other lure has. Spoons don't ever do anything twice exactly the same way. There's a bajillion kinds of them, and they each behave a little bit different. And the beauty of a spoon is that they have their own erraticness built in. You don't, as an angler, have to necessarily do anything to make that spoon erratic. And erraticness, is, if you're a fan of Fishful Thinker, is a key thing that I look for in a lot of scenarios where I want a lure to be very erratic. And spoons do that better than a lot of other lures because of their super simplistic design. And I was at the International Sport Fishing Hall of Fame in Dania, Florida years ago, and that's where I read about the fact that the simple spoon was one of the earliest designs of lures, so to speak, where we just took something shiny, we hammered it flat, and that became our attractor for fish. And I think the term obviously comes from the fact that you could literally, and I have literally seen people take silverware and cut it apart and drill holes in it, attach hooks to it, and make them into lures. I know quite a few guys that make their own homemade spoons. I've bought custom spoons from people in the past for bass fishing, particularly great big flutter spoons. The spoon is just such a simple thing, and like I said, they're not that sexy. They don't come in 5,000 colors like some of the other things in your box, and they don't have rattles and all that other stuff for the most part, but they catch fish, and that's really important. And so I thought I'd have a quick talk about them. This may not be a really long podcast because spoons aren't particularly complicated, but there's a lot of areas that, as with anything else, There's some nuances to it for one, and then for two, I just feel like that if I can get you to have some confidence in them to throw them, you might do more of it. And particularly in bass and walleye fishing circles, you don't see them that much these days. You used to see them. Bass had a little run there for a while where guys were throwing flutter spoons, like 5-inch long flutter spoons. I want to say his name was Joe Spates, was the guy that kind of made that famous. Kelly Jordan, who I fished with once before, a BASS guy, MLF guy. I fished with him once before, and he talked about the big flutter spoons for use on Lake Fork in Texas, which is one of his home lakes. And he's the guy that kind of put him on the map for Joe Spates when he was in one of the televised events. And he made it's one of the more, in my opinion, coolest catches I've ever seen on TV. And this coming from a guy who's hosted a TV show for a long time. Kelly made a big long throw. It was really hot. He made a big long throw with this spoon that's like 6 inches long, but it's really thin. And I'll get into nuances of spoons here in a minute, but it's a really thin, really big profile spoon. And so it flutters big and wide. It doesn't go down necessarily very quickly. It flutters all over the place on its way down. He made a big throw, literally set the rod down, dipped his hat in the water, got his hair wet, picked the rod up. Before he did anything, he looked at the camera and said, "Do you think there's one on there?" and set the hook, and it was like a 5-pounder. And long story short, he knew that that spoon on the way down was the best chance of getting bit, and he was correct. He was around the right school of fish. And I also want to point out this was way before forward-facing sonar or anything like that. It was a matter of you've got a waypoint, you stay back off of that waypoint, throw back to it. And so that should tell you something about the effectiveness of the spoon. But when I think of spoons, I think of everything from largemouth bass and saltwater fish to salmon and pike up north, to walleyes, particularly in the fall and the winter. There's just a lot of, and of course trout here in my home state, Colorado, trout, a lot of guys throwing for trout. So it's just a very good all-around lure. It's also an excellent lure for white bass and stripers. And basically, in my opinion, it comes down to if you eat fish, you'll probably bite a spoon. And if you're going to eat shad, which is a specific bait fish, then you're probably really going to bite a spoon. And the thing of the erraticness of the spoon means I can also put shininess on one side and color on the other and get an excellent strobe effect. So first of all, let's talk about a couple of characteristics of the spoon, because I don't slot any of them as any one species of thing. In other words, this isn't a bass spoon or a pike spoon or a trout spoon. It's a spoon that has characteristics, and I can match it to what I need from there. So the first thing I'm going to look at overall with a spoon is the profile of that spoon, right? So the bigger the profile is, all other things being equal, the lower it will sink. So if I take two spoons that each weigh a half an ounce and one of them is twice as big profile as the other one, then it's going to sink a lot slower, and it's overall, and that will come down to the thickness of the spoon. So it's a combination of the profile and the thickness of the spoon that will have a big effect on how that thing sinks. And I've got some spoons that are so thin, and I can't even tell you who makes them off the top of my head. I've got a lot of random spoons from literally around the world, including some like European Abu Garcia spoons and some kind of strange things that you don't see in this country very often. But they're so thin you can bend them with your bare hands and change the shape of them very easily. Well, those sink really slowly, and they flutter a lot on the way down. They might sink like 6 inches a second. Other spoons I've got are very small and dense, like really dense, otherwise known as slab spoons, and they go down like crazy with a very tight vibration. So the shape and the density of the spoon will make a big difference in how that thing sinks, or the profile, I should say. Then from there, the shape of the spoon, in other words, how much bend is in it. The more rounded it is and the less flat it is, the more it will flutter in various angles as well. So when I'm picking a spoon, I'm either thinking of one of two things: either the retrieve speed that I want to run it at, or the dropping rate, the fluttering rate. In other words, how fast is it going to go down? If a spoon has got a small profile and a relatively thick body, then I can retrieve it quicker, or it will sink quicker. If it's got a bigger profile and a relatively thinner metal material, then I'll have to retrieve it slower, or it will come to the surface, or I can drop it and it won't sink as fast. So that's kind of the nuances of the spoon. For me, most of my spoons are going to have at least one side be shiny. Okay, so when I'm picking colors over and above, so I look at profile first, the general size of the spoon, then the density or the thickness of the spoon, then the shape of the spoon, and then the color. And usually for me, a spoon's gonna have chrome or gold on at least one side. And to be honest with you, most of my spoons are mostly shiny, either silver or gold. Those are my two favorites. Pretty much what your choices are when it comes to spoons as far as shiny goes, but also copper, particularly copper in salt water. A copper spoon can be a really good thing as well. But if I do have colors on them, it's typically colored on only one side, not a solid color spoon, because I want the strobe effect of the whole thing. And if you look at something like a very classic, an Acme spoon, an old school Pike spoon, the red and white Daredevil being a classic one, silver on one side, red and white on the other. That's the kind of thing I generally do, except for most of my spoons, if they do have color on them, it's going to be a white, a chartreuse, a greenish hue or blue hue of some sort is the colors that are going to be on it, or it's going to be an orange type or a red, a hot color, which is going to be the case of salmon and trout more often than not. Maybe pike, but usually my spoons are going to be some combination of white or gold and, silver or gold, and then white or chartreuse or green, somewhere in that range. One of the famous colors is called coleslaw. It's kind of white, green, and chartreuse. Or it'll have a little bit of blue on it. And those are the spoons I use most often. And I'll be honest with you, for me, a spoon is most often either vertical or a hybrid retrieve, meaning I don't generally just throw and wind them in, even though I opened this podcast by saying that a spoon is very erratic on the straight retrieve. And there are some scenarios where I will do that. But when it comes to overall day in and day out, when I'm going to choose a spoon, it's because I want that fluttering fall. I want that thing to be able to settle straight down and flutter like crazy on its way down, or some hybrid thereof. So I will make a long throw, let it sink to whatever depth range I want, and then I will do a lift and then guard it and let it go down on slack line. And follow it down to whatever amount I want it to, and then lift it back and keep doing that all the way back in the same. So it's not terribly dissimilar than working a jig in that regard, other than the fact that the spoon is way less gliding and way more fluttering on the drop. And that is the magic of the whole thing, is that flutter. That flutter is what gets fish to bite. And I've seen a bunch of scenarios of trout where they'll follow it and you kill it and it starts down, and they'll literally just turn nose down and follow it straight down, and they'll get it. Whereas if you keep retrieving it, you run out of water because it's going to get too close to you. But if I see them far enough out there following the spoon, I'll just stop the retrieve and let the spoon go down. And because it will flutter on the drop, they'll get it very commonly on its way down. Excuse me, I have to get a little water there. One thing about having a forest fire right next to you is there's a lot of smoke in the air right here, and I apologize if my voice is rough or I have to drink water during this podcast, people. But the flutter drop of the spoon is really the deciding factor for me when I'm throwing a spoon versus other things. And I can make other baits erratic on the retrieve, but only down to a certain depth, right? I can take a jerk bait and I can make it erratic. A crankbait, something like that, but only down to whatever they'll dive to. You can extrapolate that out and say, okay, well, I can do a lipless crankbait at any depth, which is true, but it doesn't flutter anywhere near as erratically as a spoon does. So the spoon is really give you that really unique fluttering action, and that's really important. And I can do it at any depth, which is also an important part of it, because one of the other places where a spoon really shines is pure vertical fishing, straight up and down. That's where you hear the term slabbing. It's a pure vertical thing. It is most associated with fall. And early winter, when fish start to die off, when bait fish start to die off. But I'm of the opinion that you can get fish to bite a spoon year round on that retrieve if you can sit on top of them. And that's been proven, to me a whole bunch of times. It's also been proven in midsummer bass tournaments that a flutter spoon, even around structure, is a fantastic thing on a straight vertical drop. And the reason they're so big for bass fishing is because largemouth bass, he's named for the size of his pie hole, not the size of his brain. They like big bites, and the shad that they're eating, the shad that are dying off after spawning, are big. And so guys like James Watson got famous for throwing a great big spoon up around floating docks and letting it flutter down underneath those docks. fantastic way to get bites. It's not rhythmic, it just gets fish to pounce on it. In that case, those spoons are fluttering very slow. They're exceptionally thin with a big profile. Conversely, let's say I'm fishing deep for walleyes in fall, and I'm fishing them pure vertical that way. Well, that might be something more like a Castmaster that you're familiar with, or a Johnson Sprite, which is a very similar spoon. It is small and dense and heavy, and it flutters very quickly, and it will go to the bottom 50 feet down or 30 feet down or 20 whatever feet down quickly, and you can work it up and down very quickly right there, and that's a difference altogether than the big flutter spoon. I want to point out that we won a junior state championship one time as a coach, or I did, by sitting at a no-wake buoy in like 80 feet of water. And I've got my bass boat just parked there on a GPS anchor, and I'm right at the edge of the no-wake zone. And it's an interesting story because it's very, very much buck the trend, and no one can understand how it was we were catching fish or why we were catching fish. Well, what we were doing, we were throwing a 1/6 ounce spoon that's almost 2 inches long, 1.5 inches long, but only weighs a 1/6 ounce, which means it's very thin, like bend it with your hands thin. Throwing it on very light tackle and very light line and making as long a throw as you can with it. But here's the key. There's a whole bunch, this is a midsummer tournament, and there's a whole bunch of shad, young of the year shad in the system, and they're very high in the water column. My boat's sitting in like 80 feet of water at the no wake zone, and every time a boat came out of the marina and got to that no wake zone and powered up, hit the throttle and left because they got out of the no wake zone, I had both kids throw into their prop wash as close as we could get to the back of their boats without hitting their boats. We literally sat right at the no wake line and threw right into their prop wash. And every time a boat would leave, over the course of a whole 8-hour day, we spent the whole day sitting right there. And every time a boat would leave, we would throw right in their prop wash, and about 3 out of every 5 of those, we would get bit almost immediately, and they were all big smallmouth. And what's going on is when those boats hit the throttle at the no wake zone, they disrupt all those young of the year shad, and they scatter every which way. And when they do that, that spoon comes fluttering down in between them, and that's where those big smallmouths suspended in open water are taking advantage of those bait fish that are also out in that open water. So, and the older I get, the more I believe that, and the more I've observed, and the more I know, I should say, that there's a lot of big smallmouth in wide open water in western reservoirs. I mean, wide open water. And I think more than what people have ever realized, certainly more than what I realized for many years, but as time goes on, I realize there's more and more of them out there. And typically the biggest ones I catch every year are high in the water column, here in my home lake anyway, are high in the water column over deep water. So like topwater baits over 100 feet of water, or 6 ounce flutter spoons over 80 feet of water type thing. So, and I want to point out, those spoons were not sinking far. We were only letting them sink 10 or 12 or 15 feet tops, and then ripping them up and then letting them settle all the way back to the boat. And the one key to a spoon of any kind, I don't care how you're fishing a spoon, fish will not hold on to your spoon. It doesn't matter what the species is. I don't care, if you put scent on it or anything else. When they hit that, they're going to spit it out in a hurry, because the one negative is the spoon doesn't feel right, it doesn't taste right, it doesn't smell right, but it looks right. It has the action, it has the strobe effect to be something that's fluttering down in the water column, and it's a good way to get bites. I can also tell you from having largemouth bass in fish tanks that you can drop a dime in there and they'll blast it every time. You can literally reach in there and get the same dime and drop it back in, and when it starts fluttering and picks up the light from the tank and starts strobing its way to the bottom, they'll blast it. They don't ever seem to figure it out. It just seems to be something in their brain that they can't seem to overpower, even though they know they can't eat it. They've hit it 3 or 4 times in a row, but there's something about it that makes them smack it. And in that case, the dime-sized spoon is being hit by fish that are, the dime itself is being hit by fish that are 3 inches long. It's gigantic for them, but it's still that shiny thing. And I think that strobe, the pulse of light that comes off like a signal mirror. Same reason they tell divers not to wear shiny wristwatches, and why they don't put chrome rims on masks anymore, because barracudas will fall for the same thing. That shininess, that strobe, and they'll grab it based on pure instinct. And that's a key part of the triggering quality of the spoon. I want to throw out here too, about the only time I'll horizontally just straight retrieve a spoon is one of two scenarios. Either in a river, which I will do for trout in a river pretty commonly, or salmon in a river, as the case might be. For sure, I will definitely straight retrieve it there, because the erraticness of the spoon and the moving water will make it do plenty for me. Plus, I don't have the depth to work with in most cases. The other scenario should be obvious for that same reason, and that is flats fishing. And one of my favorite things to throw on the flats is still an old school Johnson Sprite gold spoon or a copper spoon. And I throw them in bigger sizes there typically, because I want them to go fast. At no point do I want that spoon to be slow and methodical. In that scenario, working over grass flats, I want that spoon to be fast. And typically, I'll even add more erraticness to it by making as long a throw as I can, immediately let it settle under the surface just enough that you can start retrieving it, and then snap the rod tip about every 3 feet as I'm retrieving it to make it really dance. And the largest sea trout I ever caught, bit that. It was about a 7 or 8 pounder, bit that retrieve. Some of my biggest redfish have bit that retrieve. A big old snook. I've had some huge snook grab a Johnson Sprite spoon being retrieved like that as well. Not to mention a whole slew of jacks and everybody else that'll grab it. So the beauty too of the spoon is it's not exceptionally expensive. You can throw them a long ways, and they're fairly simple, right? I mean, you tie it on, you throw it. A spoon is also one of the few baits where I will use a swivel. I will specifically use a swivel in line, and depending on the scenario, I will either have that swivel be above a leader. In other words, maybe I'll have braided line tied to a swivel and then a short leader and the spoon. That's a very common scenario for me. Rather than having a knot, a connection where there's line to line knot, I'll tie the braid, I'll Palomar it off to the swivel, and it's always the smallest swivel I can get and just big enough to not go through the tip guide. So if I do over-reel it, it's going to stop at the tip guide, and then I'll tie a Palomar knot to one end of it, and then I'll just tie the leader off to the other end. The other scenario is I will put a split ring on the front of a spoon and put a swivel on that split ring. That's what I will do typically for saltwater situations, where I can tie my fluorocarbon leader straight to that swivel. I'm not a fan of snaps on most lures either, almost hardly any. But there's a couple scenarios where I'll use a snap on a spoons, and that's any spoon, and this is a big statement right here, any spoon that's cross-drilled, meaning they drilled a hole straight through the middle of the metal, and that's how you're going to tie to it, it needs to have either a clip or a split ring on it, because those, basically you end up with two 90-degree edges on either side of that metal when they drilled that hole in it. And even if they finished it and did a decent job with it, you're still going to take your nylon or your fluorocarbon, it's going to be kinked hard right there where you tighten it. So either a cross-lock snap or a split ring will go in through that hole to avoid the line being chewed up by the spoon itself in that scenario. So that's the one thing I do different in spoons. In fact, my box of spoons that I carry in the boat all the time, which range everywhere from 6 inches long to 2 inches or so, 1.5 inches long, and go everywhere from 1/6 of an ounce, as I already mentioned, all the way up to a few ounces for some big spoons. There's in that box a selection of split rings and a selection of clips, because I will modify them as I use them to go, as needed as far as that goes. Now, the one scenario, and this is almost counterintuitive, the one scenario where I'm not a huge fan of spoons is in really stained water. And in really stained water, the strobe effect just isn't enough, in my opinion, and the spoon is too erratic. And what I mean by that is a fish is going to use his lateral line to try to home in on that spoon, right? So he's going to feel it. He's going to try to move in on it, and then ultimately, once they get close enough, because they can't smell it and can't taste it, he can only feel it or hear it. In that scenario, they need to get within range and be able to spot it, and they'll strike at the strobe and miss. And so if you start foul hooking a bunch of fish around the top of the head and the face and all that, you either need to make your spoon a little bit more or a little bit less erratic, I should say, add a little bit less action to it, or switch it to something else. But that's a common scenario where I will put the spoon down. And if I am going to throw a spoon in stained water, for instance, in salmon fishing, I've done a little bit of that, then that spoon is going to be a very hot red color or a very hot orange color. And that's going to basically allow them to find it. And that's because salmonids of all kinds their eyes are tuned into reds, oranges, and pinks. So that's why you see so many different salmon lures in those colors, and I'll fall for that classic vibe right there. Otherwise, the spoon for me is a clear water bait, and or very, at least reasonably clear water bait, and it's pretty much always a high speed bait. There's not really a scenario where I'm fishing a spoon really slowly. I think it's because they don't look that real. Anytime a fish gets too long to look at it, they're not likely to bite it unless you can see that they're looking at it and make a significant change to how it's acting. So a spoon, more than other lures, will get follows a lot of the time. And I don't know why, but it seems to mesmerize fish, and they'll follow it. So another interesting anecdote here real quick. Dan Swanson and I were fishing for lake trout, and we weren't sure. We could see fish on the graph, and we weren't sure if they were lake trout or rainbow trout. And he says, well, drop a spoon all the way to the bottom, right into them, and then wind it slow and even straight up. And if they're lake trout, one of them will follow it all the way to the surface. And I'm skeptical, but whatever. I tie a spoon on, I throw it out there. Dan's smarter than me, and I let it go down to those fish, and I retrieve it up, and sure enough, about a 2-foot lake trout followed it all the way to the surface. I never did get one of them to bite the spoon on that trip, but they love to look at it. And so it's a good way to locate fish. Same thing with regular trout, just for the record. I've done really well just retrieving that, walking banks and retrieving that spoon and using it almost as a 1-2 punch, where you can draw the fish in with the spoon, figure out where they are, and then you can throw back at them. Another classic one, I had 2 friends fishing on the bank here not that long ago. One of them's throwing a spoon and one of them's throwing a fly rod. Well, the one throwing the spoon's not catching anything. The guy throwing the fly rod's catching a whole bunch. So the one throwing the spoon says, well, I don't want to fish anymore. I'm going to put the spoon down, and I'm not even going to fish because you're catching them anyway. Well, dude with the fly rod's like, wait a minute, don't do that, because what's happening is dude's throwing his little tiny wet fly, like an 1.5 long little kind of hybrid streamer wet fly looking thing, right at the spoon every time the other guy's retrieving the spoon. And what the other guy, who is a novice angler, didn't realize is he's getting pot licked like crazy, because the trout are following the spoon in because they're mesmerized by it, but then they grab that fly that he's throwing on top of it. And sure enough, as soon as the guy put the spoon down, the fly guy quit catching fish. So I've also used spoons on guide trips to get fish to show themselves so that I can get a client to understand that there's fish here. So I'll use a spoon with no hooks on it and retrieve it in and get fish to follow it that way. But a couple things with the spoon to kind of simplify the whole thing. The faster you want that spoon to be, you need a smaller profile with a higher density and less bend. The slower you want it to be, you need either a larger profile, a thinner body, or more bend to it. That's step 1. For step 2, if it's cross-drilled, put a split ring or snap on it no matter what. For 3, spoons do better on light line if at all possible. They flutter more on light line, so keep that in mind. It's all about controlled slack with the spoon. And then the other thing is, it's more or less a clear water bait for most scenarios. And I haven't really found fish that won't react to a spoon. Like I said, white bass and stripers love them, wipers. They love them. The deep walleye bite in the fall, or even smallmouth bite in the fall when shad are dying off, very classic thing. Great way to run a flutter spoon of some sort in there as well. So there's tons of spoons out there. Like I said, when I worked at Sportsman's Warehouse, it was a whole aisle of spoons, and guys would spend a lot of time on that aisle picking out different spoons. So I know a lot more of you throw them than what they get attention in magazines and TV shows and podcasts. And in fact, I might have to do a TV show later this year that's all spoons, just to show you guys what's up with that, because that's how strongly I believe in them, and I believe they're very underrated as lures go. So again, visit the folks at Sportsman's Warehouse or Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. I would appreciate that very much. Get your spoons at Sportsman's while you're there. If you want to join the conversation on social media, that's at Fishful Thinker, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Of course, Altitude Sports and World Fishing Network are airing multiple times a week on both those networks, so you can check out that on your local cable provider. Check us out there, and especially the YouTube channel. We're doing some more work for that right now. We've been slow the last 2 weeks on getting stuff uploaded, some of it to do with this fire, some of it to do with me traveling, but we're getting back on that right now, and hopefully you guys will check that out. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.